For many Biden fans, they seem to be now, as this really is heating up, you can ignore it if you want, but this is the news, so we don't ignore things. They seem to, in the Democratic Party, want to walk a line between facing these questions with some confidence and also invoking the benefits of experience to argue Biden has learned things, but is not washed out.
Hi, I'm Ana Marie Cox. This is 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. We have 61 days until the election. Been doing the show for 29 days, and it's flown by. The whole point of this show is to talk to smart people about the wild and historic things that have been happening in this campaign so far. One of the smartest people I know. He is the host of The Beat on MSNBC, Ari Melber. Welcome, Ari. The Beat is on at 6 p.m. Eastern.
It's true. Thanks for having me.
And you are also the chief legal correspondent for that network you're on.
Yeah.
MSNBC.
Plenty to report on.
Yeah. So what's on your mind? Like, as a person perceiving this from your particular position, both as a host and also as someone who's looking at this could just be like the law. I mean, it is the law and order election, basically.
Yeah, I think what's most striking, we've all lived through the recent changes in the campaign, is how much things can change quickly, which includes unprecedented events. No president has ever dropped out this late, as people know or have heard. We've never had a candidate who's a convicted felon in one state and awaiting trial in other states run. And yet, in the past few weeks, all the attention and energy has been more about the new nominee, Kamala Harris, for the Democrats than all those other things. And so I think that's a reminder that while different things matter, the very nature of something being a priority, say for the voters or for the reporters who are telling the story, means that other things recede, even if they're also of great importance. And so the Democratic enthusiasm we're seeing is a reminder that it's always hard to beat something with nothing. And spending years talking about the danger of Trump is very different than the Democrats appearing excited about someone else actually being president.
You know, that points to sort of a general observation that I've had in this election, having covered way too many of them, is the sense that I do think the media, and let's say mainstream media, legacy media, however you want to talk about it, has a better understanding of their role in the process than in years past, as a part of the electorate rather than simply an observer of the electorate. You know, am I making sense in that way?
Well, I think that a lot of the traditional or credentialed media is, first of all, aging out of internet blog era, which is when you and I first met professionally, and that has now been, like all countercultures that are successful, somewhat absorbed and consolidated by what is now the mainstream culture. And so the discussions that used to be sort of Jay Rosen and an academic or blogosphere critique of the press are now, you have younger working reporters who came up with at least that discourse. So whether they sign on to all of it or not, they're certainly aware of and pick somewhere on the spectrum of the idea that the press has an actual participatory role to play, that there's very rarely a view from nowhere and total neutrality, that fairness and objectivity are different than claiming you're neutral. Many easy examples. If you're fighting ISIS and they're against everything America stands for, and they kidnap and murder journalists, can you really honestly claim that you're completely neutral on the resolution of your society versus ISIS, which is different from whether you objectively cover that conflict and whether there are allegations or evidence of misconduct on the U.S. side of that conflict, which you could do while also admitting you don't really want ISIS to win. So, I'm jumping around, but all of that, I think, in this current and somewhat evolved media membership, I think makes, at least for some more awareness of those challenges, while you still see traditional media make tons of mistakes.
Yeah, I like the idea of calling them credentialed, actually. I think that that's an interesting distinction. and legacy and mainstream are also helpful. That's a really good point. That discourse about the fact that there is no view from nowhere and that everyone has is coming in with their preconceived notions and their social and economic upbringing. And I think the diversity of newsrooms has had a real part in making that even legacy, those legacy institutions aware or more aware of how covering stuff you can think you're doing it neutrally, but if you're covering it as white people, as liberal, as people who grew up in like sort of a neoliberal context, as an able-bodied person, like all of those things like matter when you're covering anything, but especially covering, I know you didn't make this equivalency of like the right wing being like ISIS, but I'm going to make the equivalency.
No, I wasn't speaking out of the I'm talking about people cover war. It's always funny when someone in the old days or old school, they say, oh, totally neutral. I don't even vote
Right.
And I'm not trying to shade anyone in particular, but it's sort of like, okay, you don't vote, but in World War II, you pick a side and you live it inside one of the countries at war. And so on the big things, on the biggest things ever, you have a view, then why would then it be so important to say, or perhaps imagine that you don't have a view on much smaller things like federal education funding?
Or much bigger things like global climate change, right? Like that one could argue is as big an issue as World War II. Like it is a coming threat that could kill all of us, that ultimately has no discrimination, right? Like maybe gets like the more disadvantaged first, but to cover that as though there's both sides, like is covering a war like there's both sides that deserve to speak. I think, not putting words in your mouth.
I wouldn't put it quite that way, but we're just chatting. You put it that way. I mean, I also think that it's important to note that there's a lot of bad faith media criticism, and there's also people who have other things that they care about more than whether the media is doing a good job or fair, and that's fine. It's a free society. But we deal with campaigns that are working the press. I have the view of having been a lawyer and briefly worked in government and politics and now trying to do a fair job, which is up to the viewers and the citizens to decide night by night. And some nights we do probably better than others, and some nights we don't do as well as we'd like. But I see operatives trying to work the press in both parties. I see a system and governments around the world that are very averse to transparency when it cuts against their interests. And so it's also become a hobby horse, I think, to pretend that attacking the press is always righteous, or that tearing down the press will somehow naturally produce something, at least that side or that group feels is good. And I think that's something I see a common sort of premise, as if the traditional, or like I said, the credentialed press is on par with, some fossil fuel terrible company that you think shouldn't have power. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think the constructive parts of the press act quite specifically as a counterbalance and need to have some power and credibility, which is different from what I think becomes people just wanting to tear them down. So to get back to what we talked about with the campaign, there are parts where I look up and think, oh gosh, they're making the same mistakes dealing with Trump as years ago. But I don't think that's bad because people want to defeat the election of Trump. Many people do, and that's politics. I think it's bad because the press is falling into traps and not doing a good job and doing a disservice to its audience. And a good example of that cuts the other direction is there are a lot of different reasons why the obvious, now resolved question over whether Joe Biden should really run again. There are a lot of big questions about that were probably undercovered in general. And you can look at the reasons for that, right? And so that's a situation where it was a Democratic thing. It has nothing to do with Trump being a liar and MAGA and this and that. And it reminds you that, gosh, if something was big enough and true enough for enough Democrats that it resulted in this unprecedented change, why was it so hard to talk about and why was it so undercovered? And not to plug the beat, but, we had multiple early segments on it. I mean, before the debate and all this, And I remember some people having very negative reactions to that. And I just thought, oh, that's so interesting, because even the polling shows the majority of Democrats want a different nominee. So that, not that we put the reporting up to a poll, but like people having a negative reaction to us covering what is very clearly a legitimate debate over whether Joe Biden should serve 4 more years, a debate that the party's now resolved.
I think that's a really good point. And I put myself in the position of, I do think that I've overcorrected in some of my criticism of the press. I was privately complaining to a lot of people that Biden was too old. Not too old. Actually, I said this on the show, my show before.
Say it artfully,
that it's
and I
not
know
a
what you mean.
problem of too old. It's a problem of mental facility, right? Like,
Yeah, or
there are plenty of people his age who I would vote for. Well, I can't say that, but like, it is not a function of age. It is a function of mental decline.
Was this person in this visible condition up to this job for what would have been 5 more years? And was he so uniquely qualified and positioned for this job that it would be unthinkable to look at alternatives like the alternative we now have, who was blessed by him, who seems to be doing potentially fine. We'll see if she wins the election. She's certainly already vice president, which means she's already a heartbeat from the presidency, right? And so, yeah, I think the party, for political and other reasons, really suppressed and censored having that conversation. And it's kind of interesting as a real world thing to look at now, in public, I mean.
Yeah, and I think it was a cooperative venture of the press and the party. And what I mean by cooperative venture is not necessarily one that was intentionally embarked upon by the press, but I think that there is a place for the criticism of access journalism, and people also, I've talked about this with fellow reporters, is that there were a lot of people who were trusted sources in the White House saying he's fine, right? Like giving out the message on the down low, off the record and on the record, it's not as bad as you think. And I think there were a lot of reporters that believed that.
Yeah, but what else are they going to say?
I know, but like it's the access thing. It's the relationship thing.
I think it's also I think that makes sense. There's also a dynamic where if you think that your job is to predict things or work in concert with what's happening, then you become overcommitted to what's happening, as opposed to really trying to be independently say, well, this is a fact, so we're discussing it. And if somebody says, well, it's too late to change the nominee, you're like, whatever. Like that's not even an inbounds objection to reporting things out, right, that matter. And then the Republican version of that would be how many Republicans have said, well, if Trump still has a hold in the base, then he could do nothing that disqualifies him.
Yeah. Well,
that is a premise that provides for, I guess, potentially anything terrible, which is not how you want any responsible adults to govern a party or the government, right? That if you say, well, it's only up to the vote, we've already determined that these people like this person, could be a tin pot dictator in a different country, then you're never going to deal with any negative facts. I mean, that's bonkers.
Right. I'm trying to understand what you're saying. And there may be a parallel, but I'm trying to understand exactly the parallel.
I think a lot of the DC and political press felt like, well, once Joe Biden has the nomination, there's nothing left to discuss. And that's a true statement for people in the party who are running the party. But it's not how responsible independent journalists should operate, because you're not beholden to that outcome. So imagine a different scenario. Again, let's take the players out of it. Imagine a movie where the president seems debilitated, but the party doesn't want to bring in the VP because they don't want to take that step. And part of the press's job is to say, like, this guy can't do the job, and we're talking about running the country.
I am completely on board with that, especially as framed about what happened with Biden. Like, you can even just say Biden. Yes, that is what happened.
Well, I'm not saying Biden because, again, I'm not a doctor. I'm not making that.
So I agree that it doesn't have to be. You could talk about any president, and that is true, and it is particularly true. It's a true as a general proposition, the movie, right? And it's also true I think, as an example of what happened. What's interesting to me is sort of to place, like, how do we look at the job of well, first I'll just lay my cards on the table, which is that as someone who feels like the entire idea of free press is under threat should Trump win, there is a part of me that's just cheering now. I'll just say it. Like, I don't want to put the election, I don't want to put the possibility that Trump will win at risk. Like, that's just, and I have to sort of separate out like my deep terror at that.
Well, I guess the question then
With
becomes,
like
though,
what the job of journalists
Well,
is right now.
someone might feel that way, but then does that mean that they see their role in what they say and do as electioneering, as helping one side or not? Like, for me, I'm going to be reporting on what the facts are. And if some of those, even if you could say hypothetically in an experiment, those facts mean that this or that person is more or less likely to win the election, I'm not using that as a reason to cover or not cover something in my role. And we have different roles. But like, I think that the issue is not, kind of like what we talked about earlier, it's not whether you're transparent with people about what you want, but at what point are you like, well, you're not going to cover something because you're trying to engineer an outcome?
Yes. And I think, and I agree and I respect that way of thinking about it. And I think that that is probably a necessary part of maintaining some level of, to try and work back the public's belief in the press, is doing that kind of job. I also am just terrified that everything gets undermined. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm not working in mainstream press anymore, honestly.
Right.
I mean, it's just
and
that,
again,
like, it's just like, I mean,
not everyone has to
I
do the
guess I'm
same
glad
thing.
you're doing that job. But what I was going to say, to put my cards on the table, is that when there was discussion about whether or not Biden had the mental, faculties to be president, and also a point that I tried to make, I did make in public, was it's not just a question of whether or not he has, enough on the ball to do this job. His age plays a function. His age plays a role in the fact that he cannot talk about some of these issues in the way that they need to be talked about now. Like when he conceded, late term abortion in the debate. Like, to me, that was a more significant statement than all of the mumbling, right? Like,
Well,
he still conceives of that as being the thing that is to be given ground on.
Well, I don't know that he, in that night, was very capable of engaging on it substantively.
Oh, I agree. But like, if you wanted to pick out, like, here's an example of like why he's not fit, is that not only is he just stumbling around, but like he has this particular fixed idea that he can't seem to let go of, So I was saying, like, so my cards on the table is that, like, I was having private conversations with people, including Democratic operatives, about how my fingers, like my knuckles turned white every time he was on screen, like, just as someone who wanted the party to win. Although it's funny, like, but I was very reluctant to have that conversation in public. I was like,
right. And so if you really want to go deep on this, that is a bit of the ironic paradox of, and I'm not ascribing motives to you, but at least for people who didn't want to talk about it in public because they assumed he would be the nominee. So in the service of that, of assuming that was the reality, they hid realities or didn't want to discuss them, which ultimately, when discussed transparently in our society, led to a change.
Yeah.
And so again, I mean, another way to say it is it's not a black and white between people saying, I'm doing this type, I'm doing that type. It's really a question about how we self-govern, which happens outside of elections as well. In other words, we can't just think of it as occasionally there are these votes and then things happen. It was, as someone who's reporting on this, it was remarkable to see what is a political party. And rarely, I would say, rarely, every few decades do you have something this big. You could have a contested convention back when that was the rules, and this thing we lived through where you saw, so Nancy Pelosi, there's no title on her name right now that gives her more power than the other member of Congress, but it would be naive to say that without that title, she's just one of 435 members. She, not only her, because some of that's been sort of hyped, but she played, from my observations and reporting, a pivotal role in private and in public, keeping the issue alive in order to get to the place she wanted. And that was distinct from many other party members. You kind of watched and again, I would say in fairness, a credit to her and other leaders that they did what a political party is actually supposed to do. They didn't just bow to the power of the fact that he's the current president or the fear of what would happen. They said, yep, given the events and facts that were public, they were going to try to, as a party, organize a change. And then they did it. And if they win the election, Pelosi and others will be heralded for that. If they lose, though, I'm sure there'll be a lot of second guessing about everything, including whether maybe it should have all happened earlier. But it's remarkable. But that, I would argue, is the combination of factual information, not handicapped for what you want to happen, but just dealing with it in a public environment, and then a party healthy enough to process it. If you want to contrast that, I don't mean to insult the Republican Party, but I think it's factually the case that it does not currently operate that way. So even when presented with horrific information about their candidate before he became the nominee, and then now he is the nominee, Trump, they couldn't ever address all that, even though their own leaders, including the current Speaker of the House and the running mate, J.D. Vance, publicly recently said Donald Trump's unfit for office with friends like those, right? So
Right.
that's a party contrast, which there's no false equivalence. One party can't deal with the facts that its own members shared. I mean, the speaker said Trump would be dangerous in office.
So I think those are really smart points, and you're making me consider my beliefs in my personal life, which have to do with being mostly honest and letting things happen, letting the chips fall where they may to a certain degree. And the importance of personal integrity and making a personal choice that aligns with your morality, aligns with your beliefs. And that is all one can ask of anyone, right? Is to keep a level of integrity with themselves and hopefully, with others. But what you're making me think about is the degree to which it is not just a matter of like, oh, the Democratic Party has been able to do this, respond to honest reporting and internal and external pressures. And the Republican Party has not been able to. Because I think there might be something just in the politics of the other party that keeps its members from being able to do that kind of work.
I think that's true.
That if you are in thrall of fascism, not even in thrall of Donald Trump, right? He's a placeholder for bigotry and fascism and oppression. It is really hard. It is just not within your mental scaffolding to be able to make the kinds of choices based on information, new information,
Well, I think you raise an important point that, again, when you talk about like what a weird time we're in, what a bad time it is in many ways, not all Republicans, and I have a lot of Republicans, including Trump officials on my program, and I deal with them each individually like any of us would want to be dealt with. So not painting with a broad brush, but you can go through and make the list. I name check Mike Johnson because, again, it's not your or my values that we're substituting. We're citing his publicly stated adult values. The guy's a public official. He's running for office. He says Trump would be dangerous. Here's why we have to stop him. We all know that J.D. Vance. And so we are living through this absurd lie of all these people publicly performing for Trump and his followers when we actually know what they very recently said as adults. And then I think related to that, and I think you alluded to this, the current MAGA Republican Party has lies as part of its litmus test. Lies about Donald Trump's history, lies about, of course, January 6th, lies about the election. I mean, I've had otherwise previously serious people unable to acknowledge that Donald Trump lost the election in 2020 because they are a part of that world or they might potentially want to work in that world in the future. And so that means that, again, people have wide debates about ideology, and we have to. and we should all remember as a point of intellectual humility, things that were widely believed to be right or wrong can change. So even if we have strongly held beliefs today, one thing is you do your best with what you got. Another thing is you try to remember, if you are in the reality-based society, that you are open to change, that evidence, facts, and moral reasoning may evolve. And if we do that together, I think we're better off. And there's a lot of societal record for the societies that do that versus those that become closed loops of autocratic thinking. And so, because that's been drummed out of at least big questions, I mean, maybe you could find some Republicans who could pull up a report about agricultural policy and work off the science and the facts because they hadn't been ordered by Trump to ignore the science, and they would be okay, maybe just right there. But on the election and Jan 6 and these other big litmus tests, they have to claim fidelity to a lie. And it's an incredibly dangerous scenario because democracy and a common reality are ingrained. You can't have a functional, real democracy without some effort to get reality, and that's where we are.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page here, because what I think about when you make that distinction is that it is a value. I'm not the first person to observe this. It is a value among progressives, liberals, the left, whatever, to honor rational debate. It is a value to be able to change your mind. Like, that is a value. I think all of this is broad brush, but like when I think about what I learned about politics and when I started making my political decisions, to the degree that one can make political decisions having grown up in a certain context, right? Like, I liked the idea of being able, of listening to science, of listening to judgment. And I do think that is something that was a value on the right. And it's sort of and we saw a lot of people who retain that value shift away from Trump. Right.
Right. And that's sort of like a realignment. I mean, I think,
I think there's an interesting phenomenon that maybe you've observed, which a lot of people that became never Trumpers were people who turned out to have been wrong about the Iraq War. And I think there was a humility that came from having this war go terribly, terribly wrong that made them I can't, there's probably other stuff, but that's something that I noticed. That people had been very hawkish about a war that wound up being one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern history. Came able to admit that there might be something wrong in their party.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I think we're also approaching the inflection point of the campaign, because if Trump wins, then you have that whole set of political and governing challenges. And there's a scenario where he comes in with fewer votes and is president again. And America has that legal constitutional reality where you say, so twice this person got fewer votes and controlled the Supreme Court and now is back in office, and you deal with that. Or maybe he could win by a big margin, or maybe he could lose. If he wins, you're dealing with that. If he loses, I do think they'll be having, then it would be many losses in a row. The question of what does the country and the right wing do with that? And that won't matter as much as who's in charge and going forward with life, but it will be a big question, because if you look at other periods in history when you had things go to extremes like McCarthyism or John Birch Society, or the ebb and flow of our terrible racist and civil rights battles, a key thing to when things work out well is that there is some sort of accountability and turn away from what was the excess, right? It's telling, by the way, that so many hardcore Trump fans talk about how actually Joe McCarthy's misunderstood and actually Nixon should have remained president. And they look at those, what are taught in most traditional American history courses as canonical self-correcting times, and say, actually, no, the correction was the problem. We should have gone further down the criminal Nixon path, further into McCarthyism. So I think it will be important how that's all resolved over time if he loses, and the legal process will be a part of that, because none of this is guaranteed, and people have been reminded about how tenuous democracy can be. So that's why on the one hand, I notice, I notice anecdotally people seem kind of exhausted and sort of like they don't want to be in a constant activist fighting mode for democracy, for women's rights, for civil rights. And yet it is still true, even though it's become a thing that politicians repeat, that it's an important election, and these next few years are going to be really important. And maybe it would be more peaceful to live in more boring times. It doesn't look to me like those are the times we're fated to live in.
Yeah, I mean, voting, we have other people on the show have said, like, voting is just the start, and the end of a campaign is just the start, no matter who wins. Like, I hope that people are able to recognize that even a Trump loss doesn't mean we are okay, that the fight for civil rights, for the rights of, gay and lesbian and trans people and queer people, those rights still have to be fought for and continue to be protected. So I know you have to jump. Do you have any final thoughts?
I do think these are important, interesting conversations to have, particularly outside of the normal dynamic. Like, I do what I do in a more narrow zone sometimes, because it's like, here are the interviews, here's the breaking news, we're here talking it out. When people ask me, because for whatever reason, people come up to me a lot and they say, are we going to be okay? Or like, is everything going to turn out okay? And I'm always like, I obviously don't have the answer to that in any factual sense. Like, who am I? But the line I sometimes give people is I say, I'm short-term pessimistic, but I'm long-term pessimistic. And that's my joke that but I actually think that I grew up in Seattle, and it's pretty, trees, yoga, spiritual environment. And some of that stuff still hits or still slaps, as the kids say. And I actually do believe that when people at the end of it, they say, well, but it's really back up to us. I think that's largely true. It's not a fair measurement of us, right? The billionaires have more power, and the systems aren't measured fairly. And people, if you've paid attention at all, about that. Wait, so you have enough votes for gun control in the Senate, but no, for certain things, you need more than 51 votes. Okay. Oh, we don't really use popular vote in electoral college. Some of these things are stitched in. But big picture, long term, if you look at things that have worked, if you look at the civil rights movement, if you look at the march of America has been towards more democracy and more people voting the whole time. So it started out as what today we wouldn't even call that a democracy. But that long march is pretty good, actually. And if you compare it to other countries, it's really good. So that whole maybe hippy dippy idea that it's up to us and that you go get engaged and you get informed and you work at whatever level makes sense for you, which could be your community, it could be 10 minutes a day, and then you go back to trying to earn a living or get your life going. Everyone's got challenges. I still buy that. So that's why I'm actually not literally long-term pessimistic.
I know you have to go. Thank you for being on the show. This is 90 days, 61 days. Host of The Beat on MSNBC at 6 p.m. Also a very popular YouTube channel, msnbc.com/Ari.
That's right. We post nightly there, and we found a lot of people engage with our videos, and it's free. It's not paywall. So msnbc.com/Ari for the nightly YouTube playlist. Nice to see you.
All right. Nice to see you too. If you are listening to this as a podcast, you should know it is also available as a YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/@90 Days with Ana Marie Cox, and that's a 90. If you are watching this on YouTube, you should know it's available as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And no matter how you are consuming it, please rate, review, like, subscribe, comment, promote, tell your friends and neighbors. This is a countdown to the election. 61 days from today. Tomorrow it'll be 60. Until next time.
The biggest presidential campaign news this week is Trump getting that RFK Jr. endorsement, but that can come with baggage. Does the Trump campaign stand by RFK's many conspiracy theories and COVID disinfo? Well, we just put that question to a current top Trump campaign official who also ran his 2016 campaign, Corey Lewandowski. This was just last night. Here is his answer.
This is
Is Donald Trump endorsing RFK Jr.'s vaccine conspiracy theories?
Well, RFK Jr. has been someone who's been very steadfast in making sure that when it comes to the decisions that affect your body, you get to choose.
I asked you, though, about RFK's actual conspiracy theories.
Ari, I'm not here to answer questions for RFK Jr. He's a big man. I think when it comes to RFK, specifically those moms who have young children, they're very concerned about what is being injected into their children, whether it's through the food supply or through these vaccines. And RFK has an opportunity to go out and talk about the fact that he was right. The government should not have had to mandate those. We don't know the full impact of what was mandated by the government on the long-term repercussions that it could potentially cause. So we're very much in line with RFK on that position.
The Trump campaign sounding very open to RFK's stance there, even though he has been fact-checked for baseless conspiracy theories. For Trump, all of this is in tension with his own record as president on the same COVID vaccine. It is something that President Trump touted as amazing. He promoted vaccines as the path out of lockdowns and later said he took the vaccine and also that it was perhaps the greatest thing in centuries.
This is a very successful, amazing vaccine.
It's a great vaccine. It's a safe vaccine, and it's something that works.
I recommend take the vaccines. I did it. It's good. Take the vaccine. Some say it's the greatest thing to happen in hundreds of years.
Trump and now his aides running from Trump's record. Now, I also pressed Corey Lewandowski about a falsehood that he made the very last time he's actually ever been on this program in 2019 on The Beat. We asked about reports that Donald Trump was interfering with the DOJ probe through Lewandowski. This was back in the Mueller era. Now, it was very newsworthy. That's not my opinion, but the Congress of the United States used that interview as evidence, pressing Lewandowski and forced him under oath, where you can get in a lot of trouble for lying. It can become actually an offense. Under oath, he admitted that he wasn't being truthful and claimed he had no obligation to be honest when he speaks to the media on behalf of Donald Trump, who was then president. Now, last night, we gave him the chance to address that. Instead, he dodged questions and deflected.
I don't ever remember the president ever asking me to get involved with Jeff Sessions or the Department of Justice in any way, shape, or form ever.
That wasn't true, was it, sir?
I heard that.
And that was not true, was it?
I have no obligation to be honest with the media because they're just as dishonest as anybody else. Perhaps I was inaccurate at that time.
Do you admit that you were stating that falsely at the time?
Ari, listen, here's the deal, man.
If you admit under oath that you were not telling the truth, it is relevant now, and now you seem to be unable to address that.
Ari, listen, we've been down this path, okay?
Well, we haven't. This is your first time back since the path.
Ari, that interview was 4+, almost 5 years ago to the day, to be very honest with you.
This is now your chance to address this, and you're not addressing it. That's fine. We gave him the chance, and he is the current representative of Donald Trump's campaign. That's what it looks like when you're caught lying, Corey Lewandowski. That's what it sounds like when you're caught lying, Corey Lewandowski. And liars have a way of trying to deflect and run and dodge and do anything other than deal with the fact that he was caught lying. And it would be easy for someone to hear what he said and think, I guess it was a long time ago and maybe we move on, but that's the strategy. So you have to decide whether you're going to let them get away with it. In many of these legal probes, they delay, deny, run, and if finally caught or under the pressure of subpoena, some of them show up. And when he showed up, he had to admit, as you saw there under oath, that he was not honest when asked about that very relevant question about whether Trump was using him to interfere with a DOJ probe. In other words, a big important thing, not some random item. Now, last night we gave Mr. Lewandowski plenty of time to discuss the campaign and other issues. When we got to that one, well, you saw he just couldn't answer the question. He couldn't deal with it. He couldn't deal with perhaps knowing also that Donald Trump is known to watch these television interviews. And here he was on live TV, unable to account for getting caught lying before. Now, again, if anyone has any questions or any doubt, here is the moment when the lawyer in Congress pressed Lewandowski and he had to admit he did not tell the truth.
That wasn't true, was it, sir?
I heard that.
And that was not true, was it?
I have no obligation to be honest with the media because they're just as dishonest as anybody else.
So
perhaps I was inaccurate at that time.
Apparently, that is a forum where you will get a direct and even honest answer from Mr. Lewandowski. Under oath, where lying to Congress is a crime, where since then other Trump aides have actually gone to federal prison for issues related to misleading Congress and or, in the case of two of them in the Jan 6 probe, just not showing up at all to do what he did, to cooperate. In that forum, you get the answer. He says he's not honest with the media and he doesn't see it as an obligation. That's the representative of the Trump campaign. People can take that and make up their own mind about it.